Hello everyone, this lecture is on part 2 of The Plague by Albert Camus. Part 1 of this novel ended with a telegram message sent from a higher office to the town of Wuhan, and it read, quote, "Proclaim a state of plague, stop, close the town," unquote. The town of Wuhan is now in quarantine. Not only is human traffic disallowed between Wuhan and the rest of the world, but even letters are not allowed out of Wuhan for the fear of transmitting the plague. Now that the town gates are shut, how are the people of Wuhan doing? Quote, "From now on, it can be said that plague was the concern of all of us. Hitherto, surprised as he may have been by the strange things happening around him, each individual citizen had gone about his business as usual, so far as this was possible. And no doubt he would have continued doing so. But once the town gates were shut, every one of us realized that all, the narrator included, were so to speak in the same boat, and each would have to adapt himself to the new conditions of life. Thus, for example, a feeling normally as individual as the ache of separation from those one loves suddenly became a feeling in which all shared alike, and together with fear, the greatest affliction of the long period of exile that lay ahead," unquote. The idea of being in the same boat will remain important throughout the novel. How does the text capture it at this point? Two keywords are put forward, exile and prisoner. The people of Wuhan feel like exiles or alternatively like prisoners. Quote, "Thus, the first thing that plague brought to our town was exile. It was undoubtedly the feeling of exile, that sensation of a void within which never left us, that irrational longing to hark back to the past or else to speed up the march of time, and those keen shafts of memory that stung like fire," unquote. The feeling of exile is a sensation of a void within. Let's keep that in mind. Meanwhile, the term exile appears in another way. Quote, "Thus too they came to know the incorrigible sorrow of all prisoners and exiles, which is to live in company with a memory that serves no purpose," unquote. The feeling that comes with being an exile is the sorrow of living with a memory. What is it a sorrow to live with a memory? Because memory is by definition a mark of something lost. What is exile? To put it very simply, it means you are without home. You used to have a home, and then you were forcibly separated from it. You had a home, but you cannot return to it anymore. The people of Wuhan are certainly not away from their home. They are home. They are from Wuhan, and they are still in Wuhan. And yet they feel like exiles. Exile, in their case then, is a metaphor. What they are separated from is not their physical home, but a certain sense of security supported by, among other things, work, love, and habits, or work and love as habits even. What comes to the fore instead is death and suffering only. To extend this idea a little further, the people of Wuhan is left only with the fundamental condition of human existence, namely contingency. If we take exile in this philosophical sense, is not everyone indeed in the same boat? In the same way in which the people of Wuhan are in the same boat, that is, this crisis of the plague, all human beings are in the same boat of having to live as exiles, having to exist as exiles. At this point, the narrator introduces another term, namely prisoners. This obviously reminds us of Meursault, the hero of The Stranger. We recall our discussion of Meursault's crime as a senseless contingency. This is not to excuse the crime, but to illuminate its textual significance. There are a couple of other instances of this term prisoners which we might consider in this context. Quote, "They had been sentenced for an unknown crime to an indeterminate period of punishment," unquote. In other words, the people of Wuhan do not know what they have done to deserve this punishment. There's no way to explain it. As we know, people try to explain it, some more feverishly and others more cynically. In any case, the textual position as represented by the narrator is clear. The plague cannot be explained by the logic of cause and effect. We can easily see a parallel between the situation in which Wuhan finds itself and the human condition of being born into this world to suffer the consequences. Neither was chosen or deserved. In this sense, when people, quote, "rebelled and their one idea now was to break loose from the prison house," unquote, breaking loose means, in the main, to be able to endow the crisis with some sense, any sense that would save them from the reality of ruthless contingency. We have thus established the fact that everyone in Wuhan is in the same boat, and it's in parallel with the human condition whereby everyone lives as an exile in the land of existence. Existence comes with a particular gift that is also a curse, namely language. We get a good description of this ambiguous value of language in the following passage. People are desperate to share their thoughts and feelings with others, but never quite experience the hoped-for sympathy. Quote, "If, by some chance, one of us tried to unburden himself or to say something about his feelings, the reply he got, whatever it might be, usually wounded him. And then it dawned on him that he and the men with him weren't talking about the same thing. For while he himself spoke from the depths of long days of brooding upon his personal distress, and the image he had tried to impart had been slowly shaped and proved in the fires of passion and regret, this meant nothing to the man to whom he was speaking, who pictured a conventional emotion, a grief that is traded on the marketplace, mass-produced. Whether friendly or hostile, the reply always missed fire, and the attempt to communicate had to be given up. This was true of those at least for whom silence was unbearable, and since the others could not find a truly expressive word, they resigned themselves to using the current coin of language, the commonplaces of plain narrative, of anecdote, and of their daily paper. So in these cases too, even the sincerest grief had to make do with the set phrases of ordinary conversation," unquote. You see how the misfire of communication works here. It is not intention, but language that fails. Language fails to transfer one's feelings and thoughts to another, intact in their original forms. The moment they are expressed, they are betrayed. The same goes for people outside Wuhan. They want to express their solidarity with the people of Wuhan and express this intention in words, and the result is the same betrayal of intended message in the very conventions of communication. Quote, "Compassionate or admiring comments were lavished on the henceforth isolated town by way of newspaper articles or broadcast talks, and invariably their apical or prize speech verbiage jarred on the doctor, Dr. Liu. Needless to say, he knew the sympathy was genuine enough, but it could be expressed only in the conventional language with which men try to express what unites them with mankind in general. a vocabulary quite unsuited, for example, to Grand's small daily effort, and incapable of describing what Grand stood for under plague conditions, unquote. The point is that language is somehow insufficient, too imprecise or too elaborate. As the narrator says, language turns into verbiage, and the effect is only jarring. Meanwhile, beside this insufficiency of language to convey commonly suffered yet individually inflected experiences in all their varying shades, there's another problem which keeps the people of Wuhan in another kind of darkness, namely their tendency to believe that what happened to them is just an accident. Quote, yet they were still not sensational enough to prevent our townsfolk, perturbed though they were, from persisting in the idea that what was happening was a sort of accident, disagreeable enough, but certainly of a temporary order, unquote. This complicates our terminology a little. We are presented with three near synonyms: contingency, surprise, and accident. The people of Wuhan were scandalized by the descent of the plague on their town. They were surprised beyond measure. If surprise is an expression of incredulity over contingency, accident functions as a denial of contingency. They believe that the plague is nothing but an accident, some kind of miscalculation. On whose part, though? There's a certain superstitious thinking that operates here. In any case, they consider the plague an accident, and it is a matter of fixing it and going back to normal reality. A great example of this kind of thinking is found in the journalist Humbert. He speaks to various officers in Wuhan in order to get an exit permit, and his experiences are summed up in the following, quote, he had explained that his presence in Wuhan was purely accidental. He had no connection with the town and no reasons for staying in it, unquote. He means, I am not supposed to be here, therefore I should be an exception to the rules of quarantine. Accidental in this context means that they need to correct the error and put him back in his normal reality. Let us now have a quick review of the main events in this part. There's a great discussion between Ryu and Humbert on the concept of abstraction. We will see more of that soon. There's Father Panelu, his fiery sermon in which he claims that the plague is a punishment from God. God didn't want to punish them, but because people had turned against him, he had no choice. Under Taru's direction, sanitary squads are formed. Volunteers come together to carry out various kinds of work in response to the plague. Humbert makes many attempts to escape from Wuhan. After multiple failures with town officials, he is now willing to pay people to smuggle him out of Wuhan. Grand continues with his private work, which we know now is to write a literary masterpiece. But he's stuck with the very beginning of the novel. He continues to revise the very first sentence. There's comedy there, but there's also something very touching, even tragic, about his perseverance. Cotard, who attempted suicide earlier, is now wholly revived and even enthusiastic about life in quarantine. He is still a bit of a mystery, and this radical shift in his attitude only adds to that quality. Among the minor characters, the most striking is the asthma patient, who has no clocks in his home but keeps time by counting dried peas. Although he is a minor character, the text seems to have something to say about human existence through him. I hope everybody will consider what that might be. We now come to the first of several philosophical conversations presented in the novel. Humbert, after the aforementioned failures with town officials, comes to Ryu asking him to issue an official note proving that he does not have the plague, which would hopefully secure him an exit from Wuhan. He makes his case saying that those who just happened to be in Wuhan when the plague broke out and moreover do not have the plague have no reasons to be kept in Wuhan. Humbert insists, quote, even supposing they haven't got plague, unquote. And Ryu answers, quote, that's not a sufficient reason. Oh, I know it's an absurd situation, but we're all involved in it, and we've got to accept it as it is, unquote. We have the expression absurd situation here, and this is not a random use of the term absurd. It's an absurd situation to the extent that there is no plausible explanation for the situation, and as such, no sure method of dealing with it. The only thing that is certain is that everybody is involved in it, and nobody is exceptional. Humbert persists, quote, but I don't belong here, unquote. Meaning precisely that it was by accident that he was there at all. It was an error. Ryu answers, quote, unfortunately, from now on, you'll belong here like everybody else, unquote. And then at this point, Humbert throws another kind of argument in Ryu's way, quote, but damn it, doctor, can't you see it's a matter of common human feeling? You can't understand. You're using the language of reason, not of the heart. You live in a world of abstractions, unquote. This is where abstraction first appears, and this word will be repeated many times in the remainder of this chapter. On a different note, the fact that Humbert is exceptionally sensitive to language was very clear from the very beginning of the novel. When he accused Ryu of using the language of Saint-Just, a language of lofty, uncompromising principles, we noted that Humbert had to be alert to what language does. In that sense, he shares a certain commonality with Grand, who is very much absorbed in the question of language, although they do it very differently. To continue, our question here is, what are we to make of abstraction? Humbert uses the word abstraction as an accusation. He's criticizing Dr. Ryu for using an abstract language, for failing to understand human emotions. The implication is that abstraction and emotions are mutually exclusive. While allowing Humbert's position, Ryu also has other thoughts. Humbert's argument is rather commonplace. Quote, but public welfare is merely the sum total of the private welfares of each of us, unquote. Immediately it sounds self-evident, but upon some consideration, we realize that this is not how it really works. Take the families of the plague victims. They want to keep their sick family members in their homes. Their private welfare would be to keep their loved ones with them, which would serve their emotional needs, but that would not serve larger, wider public welfare. This conflict between private and public welfare is entirely lost on Humbert. His thinking is limited by its youthful impatience, of which Ryu's reaction proves a perfect foil. It is rather after bidding farewell to Humbert that Ryu has the following thoughts, quote, But was he right in reproaching him, Ryu, with living in a world of abstractions? Could that term abstraction really apply to these days he spent in his hospital while the plague was battening on the town, raising its death toll to 500 victims a week? Yes, an element of abstraction, of a divorce from reality, entered into such calamities. Still, when abstraction sets to killing you, you've got to get busy with it, unquote. Here, abstraction is given a fresh definition. By abstraction, Ryu refers to the death toll, the matter of numbers, statistics. The moment you count somebody, the person is nothing more than a number. The person's individuality is out of the equation. Public welfare, as addressed from Ryu's position during the plague, is largely a matter of abstraction. It is a divorce from reality. The reality of what? Of the individual person. What should concern us the most is the final sentence that we read. Quote, when abstraction sets to killing you, you've got to get busy with it, unquote. Suddenly, abstraction equals plague. How does this logic work? Here follows an explanation. Quote, once the epidemic was diagnosed, the patient had to be evacuated forthwith. Then indeed began abstraction, and a tussle with the family, who knew they would not see the sick man again until he was dead or cured. Have some pity, doctor. It was Madame Loret, mother of the chambermaid at Tarrou's hotel, who made the appeal. Then came a second phase of conflict, tears and pleadings, abstraction, in a word, unquote. The moment the victim is identified as a case, abstraction begins. The individual is hardly more than a case of the plague. The family would appeal to human feelings, to use Humbert's language. Have some pity. What does it mean? Do not abstract my child as a case. Think of her as a person, whose personhood is first and foremost testified to by her family. Yet, Ryu's responsibility is precisely to abstract her, count her as a case. This is how he can serve public welfare, and possibly the patient herself. Then begins the second phase of conflicts with the tears and pleading. Ryu describes these emotional outbursts also as abstract, and thereby contradict Humbert's logic. How are emotions abstract? We have already seen an example in The Stranger. In the courtroom, emotional outbursts are scripted, delivered for maximum effects, and thereby achieve legal goals. In the present case, the family can only see this separation as the defining element of the victim's personhood. Abstracts are out of her significance in the broader community. They don't think of the doctor as a person either, reducing him to a mere public official and assuming that he has no emotions. They are, in other words, ignorant, just like Humbert, of the fact that everybody is party to abstraction. The narrator continues, quote, yes, plague, like abstraction, was monotonous. Perhaps only one factor changed, and that was Ryu himself. Standing at the foot of the Statue of the Republic that evening, he felt it. All he was conscious of was a bleak indifference steadily gaining on him as he gazed at the door of the hotel Humbert had just entered, unquote. Not only is the plague an abstraction, but Ryu, who is fighting the plague, is also becoming abstract. This is precisely what he means by his bleak indifference. Plague, monotonous. Dr. Ryu, indifferent. You see the analogy there. Ryu then further interrogates this idea, quote, and in this feeling that his heart has slowly closed in on itself, the doctor found a solace, his only solace, unquote. This is very interesting. His heart is closed in on itself. That is, he's becoming more and more abstract. Yet, this is his only solace, this becoming like the enemy. Ryu's logic seems to be that a certain mimetic relation to the plague gives him the necessary force to fight it. As he adds, quote, to fight abstraction, you must have something of it in your own makeup, unquote. This is a tremendous idea, completely lost on Humbert and most others. Ryu does not dismiss Humbert's desire to return to his lover. He even considers a worthy purpose. The only thing that he takes issue with is Humbert's dismissal of abstraction. Ryu's point is that abstraction is not to be so easily dismissed. Allow me to add one more idea in relation to abstraction. What does the monotony of abstraction mean in the given situation? It means that it does not discriminate. Everyone is the same. Everybody is the same to the abstraction that the plague enacts. We thus arrive at another analogy here between plague, abstraction, and contingency that we discussed as the fundamental condition of human existence. The absurdity or contingency of human existence does not discriminate. It is universal. In this sense, there is a correspondence between the plague and human existence. They are both abstract and universal, insofar as they inflict contingency on everyone. We can now link this back to Ryu's argument that you need to have a little bit of abstraction in you to fight it. We can read it as meaning that one must know something of absurdity to fight it. One must be open to the world to live with contingency. This is a familiar logic to us, precisely the logic of the vaccine. Where some people see abstraction, others see truth. We have the example of Father Panelu, quote, calamity has come upon you, my brethren, and my brethren, you deserved it, unquote. This is a very daring declaration. They deserve this plague, and the reason is they had turned their backs on God. Some people agree with that idea. Monsieur Othon, who we've seen him a couple of times already, finds the preacher's arguments, quote, absolutely irrefutable, unquote. Consider this view against the one that we discussed earlier, that the plague is a punishment for an unknown crime. This other view means that people do not believe that they deserve it, or better, they don't know what it means to deserve something like plague. There are yet other views that we will discover or have to infer as we go further on. For one of these other views, we have Grand's, which is to continue his work. He declares, quote, happily I've my work, unquote. This doesn't mean that he dismisses the plague as no concern, not at all. As we find out later, he signs up to be part of a sanitary squad, and he does all that he can to help. What's really interesting at this point is how the narrator describes Grand's project. Quote, this insignificant and obscure hero who had to his credit only a little goodness of heart and a seemingly absurd ideal, unquote. I want to highlight the two words here, hero and absurd. The one who has an absurd ideal is a hero. I would like everyone to consider this formulation. What is the absurd ideal of Kang's? The creation of a language that would deliver the exact sensations that he experiences both in his body and mind. This is an absurd ideal on one level because it's impossible, and on another level because he refuses to be defeated. Kang persists, and the narrator identifies a heroism in this persistence. Kang is a true hero in this crisis, quote, the true embodiment of the quiet courage, unquote. It's not a dramatic kind of courage. He's not throwing himself into any inordinate risk. It is rather a courage not to obscure the single question and task of his life, namely language. He's not about to give it up because there's the immediate physical danger. No, the danger is there and he's going to deal with it. That doesn't mean that he will forget this other task that has defined the challenge of his existence. One reference to the question of language is worth quoting here. This is Tahu speaking in reference to Father Panelou's sermon. Quote, I can understand that type of fervor and find it not displeasing. At the beginning of a pestilence and when it ends, there's always a propensity for rhetoric. In the first case, habits have not been lost. In the second, they're returning. It is in the thick of a calamity that one gets hardened to the truth. In other words, to silence. So let's wait, unquote. This is a philosophical point. Truth is not in what one says. Truth is in silence. And to that extent, what Father Panelou delivered is not quite the entire truth or the kernel of the truth. This concludes our lecture for today. Thank you for your attention.